everyone, and welcome this evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm here with you live from the Rawlings Library. We have been so excited to host our special guest author this evening, Stephanie Dray. This program is part of our adult summer reading program and is also the first of a two-part series featuring Stephanie Dray. Stephanie is a New York Times bestselling author, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today author of historical women's fiction. Her award-winning work has been translated into 8 different languages and tops lists for the most anticipated reads of the year. Before she became a novelist, she was a lawyer and a teacher. Now she lives near the nation's capital with her husband, her cats, and of course her history books. Tonight, she will be focusing on her book, My Dear Hamilton, and once her talk is complete, she will be taking questions from those of you tuning in live. If you have a question throughout the night, please type it in the comments area and we'll be selecting a few questions for her to answer at the end. Now, please let me introduce Stephanie.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, I'm so delighted to be here with you tonight. I should note that authors can be nervous Nellies. And so it's been an interesting year where suddenly we're told the new rules, which are that we can only meet with readers from by camera, and also we can't get a haircut and can't get our nails done. So this is as good as it gets, and I'm so happy to just see human faces like yours tonight.
Well, you look absolutely wonderful, and we're so happy that you're here joining us tonight. I will just turn over to you and let you present, and then we'll tune back in for questions when you're finished.
Fabulous. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to talk about My Dear Hamilton tonight, which I co-authored with my wonderfully talented friend and co-author, Laura Camoy. My Dear Hamilton tells the epic saga of Eliza Schuyler Hamilton and her mission to define herself and her legacy as a founding mother before, during, and after her tumultuous marriage to Alexander Hamilton. Now, today we're going to talk about Eliza as a wife, a widow, and a warrior in her husband's quest for a more perfect union. Considering her in all these ways really allowed us to tell a great untold American story, because very few books, either fiction or nonfiction, have ever been written about Eliza Hamilton. There aren't many primary source resources for historians to tell her story, even though she survived Alexander Hamilton's death by duel, spoiler, and she outlived him by another 50 years. Now, this does not make her a great candidate for historical biography because no biographer can really responsibly tell that story. But we do know enough that we can write historical fiction, and that's where novels can step into the breach and tell a story that really did need to be told, but could only be told this way. Now, our immediate inspiration for writing My Dear Hamilton was, of course, the musical Hamilton. Laura saw it the first week it opened on Broadway, and at intermission, she just already knew that this was the heroine we wanted to write about next. Now, we'd already had Eliza Hamilton on a short list of candidates of we wanted to write about, including Dottie Madison and Abigail Adams, but we weren't sure until Laura saw the musical, and then she was texting me, blowing up my phone, and we met in the cab the next day on our way to the publishers to discuss our first book, America's First Daughter, about the Thomas Jefferson's eldest daughter, Patsy Jefferson. And by the time we got out of the cab, we had already decided that Eliza was our next heroine. And by that afternoon, we were plotting a plot to pitch to our editor, and we sold it shortly thereafter. So sometimes you just, when you know, you know. Now, before we really get into the weeds and talk about Eliza, a few words about Alexander Hamilton. Since he died young, he's arguably the founding father about whom Americans know the least. Or at least that was the case until he became a Broadway star. But he was George Washington's aide-de-camp during the Revolutionary War, one of the early founding members of the abolitionist New York Manumission Society. He was the most prolific author of the Federalist Papers and the conceiver of the whole project. He was one of the two men most responsible for the adoption of the United States Constitution, the other one, of course, being James Madison. He was our first Secretary of the Treasury under Washington and the primary architect of our economic system. He was the founder of the Federalist Party, one of the two first political parties in American history, and that helped create the American two-party system. For good or bad, your call. He was also the founder of the Coast Guard, the New York Post, and the First National Bank. As the musical says, the man was nonstop. He was very accomplished. But in Eliza, he really found his match, and it was important for us to show this in the novel, which is why My Dear Hamilton begins with the line, "I was someone before I met Alexander Hamilton." And that was true. Eliza was 23 years old when she wedded 26-year-old Alexander. She was a young woman who'd grown up on the frontier of New York. It's hard to think of New York as being the frontier, but at the time, upstate really was. She was reported to have been athletic, adventurous, and tomboyish. She was the descendant of Dutch patroons who were sort of the feudal leaders of New York. She came from a very strong line of women, including her mother, Catherine Schuyler, who managed the estate and often worked as a nurse for whatever frontier army happened to be passing through at the time. She was the daughter of Philip Schuyler, who was a general of the Northern Army during the Revolutionary War. He was also a spy master and a longtime negotiator with the Iroquois nation. We know that his headstrong daughters were involved in his work because his eldest daughter, Angelica, helped pass military information to him, and his second daughter, Eliza, accompanied him to treaty negotiations with the Iroquois when she was a teenager. We know this because she was adopted into the nation and given a name, and she felt that this was so important enough that she wanted to mention it quite late in life. As a general's daughter, Eliza struck us as a patriot in her own right. And this is true even before she ever met Alexander Hamilton. What's more, he agreed. His letters, actually, he worries that she wouldn't approve if he quit the cause. And he characterized her in his letters as a Portia, after a famously patriotic Roman matron. So knowing all this made it important for how we characterized Eliza in her marriage. From the beginning, their marriage was entwined with war and politics. And because the political was so often personal, it was sometimes really difficult to determine what to include and what to leave out of the book. Their marriage is central to Eliza's story, but we needed to shape the book as being more about her than about him, and more about personal victories than public ones. That probably explains why we have approximately 60,000 words of deleted scenes, which you can get, by the way, if you sign up for our newsletters at either of our websites. Mine is stephaniedray.com. Now, because the political was personal, we had to deal with a lot more early American politics than we really had to in America's First Daughter. And this is true because even though Patsy Jefferson was really instrumental in her father's political career, she wasn't with him most of the time. He was in Washington, D.C. serving as president. She did accompany him on a couple of very notable occasions where she performed duties of a first lady. But most of the time, she was keeping his plantation at Monticello running so that he could be free to pursue his political interests. This is really not the case when it came to Eliza and Alexander Hamilton. Eliza was with him almost all the time, and most of the politics that were happening at her kitchen table. So we had to decide what stays in the book and what doesn't. Now, in 1782, when Alexander Hamilton and James Madison were working together on fixing the Articles of Confederation government, we thought that was important to show because Eliza was getting her own political education then. In 1787, when Alexander Hamilton and James Madison were writing the Federalist Papers together, we wanted that to stay in because Eliza was acting as a sometimes courier for the publisher. In 1796, when Alexander drafted George Washington's farewell address, that stayed in because Eliza helped him critique and made suggestions about that, and it became a bone of contention in later American politics as to who wrote that. However, you're going to be very grateful to know that sometimes we did have to leave some things out. Sometimes we had to figure out how to make a political issue succinct and accessible and interesting. And let us tell you that the tax policy of the United States is a challenge to make interesting even when Alexander Hamilton is the one discussing it. And that's to say nothing of his mind-numbing report on American manufacturers, which we left out of the book. You're welcome. So to the extent that their marriage was entwined with foreign politics, it was challenging, but it also gave us some really great opportunities. And one of those opportunities was to show how the family dynamics were also entwined with politics. The Schuylers were one of New York's first families. They were in competition with the Livingstons, and they were very excited to help enable Alexander's career. He was very close to them, and the complicated nature of his relations with his in-laws gave us some really juicy drama in the book. It also allowed us to show that Alexander and Eliza had political and personal beliefs and value systems that were shared. Their marriage was born of mutual respect and shared patriotism, but they also both had a certain social morality. They both opposed slavery. They both advocated assistance for Native Americans, and they both worked on the cause of orphans. Eliza did make Alexander Hamilton's work possible by taking care of their house and their children, and making their meager government income stretch, and getting shipments of things that they needed and loans from their parents, more traditionally feminine work. But she also served as a hostess, which was a very politically important role at the time, an advisor, a sounding board, a scribe, a courier, and more. Alexander and Eliza appear to have been partners in much of the enterprise of founding the new nation. In fact, some of his political writings appear in her handwriting. So we think that the entwining of politics and their personal life and their love life helps explain how they weathered Alexander Hamilton's infamous affair with Maria Reynolds and his very public defense of his actions in the Reynolds pamphlet, which is a lot longer than a pamphlet, let me tell you, because Alexander Hamilton never takes 5 words to say anything that he can take 50 words to say. So Eliza knew that one of the reasons Alexander Hamilton had to write this humiliating, embarrassing pamphlet was because his political foes had really put him in a box. They were conducting an investigation into him about corruption, and the evidence was leaked by his political foes, and they said it was a cover-up of his crime, that he wasn't really having an affair. This was just the story he was telling to cover up his financial crimes, which meant that he couldn't defend himself without proving that the affair was true. So he ends up arguing to the whole world, I'm not just a thief, I'm just an adulterer. I should say that over. I'm not a thief. I'm just an adulterer. Eliza stood up for him and by him, and she paid a price. We think she stood by him because she understood that he was in a trap and that much of the credit of the American economic system would rise and fall by his reputation. And of course, the papers specifically attacked Eliza both for standing by her man and for him having strayed in the first place. There's no winning, which just goes to show you that not much has changed in American politics over hundreds of years. Now, Eliza's widowhood allowed us to show the incredible sacrifices that the founding generation made, because Alexander Hamilton actually died $55,000 in debt. And in his will, he said, "I pray God that something may remain for the maintenance and education of my dear wife and children." That did not happen. In fact, she was left destitute. She was dependent on the executors of his estate and the generosity of the Federalist Party that he had founded, because they wanted to keep his bankruptcy a secret. And the reason they wanted to keep this a secret is because they were trying to win elections, and you can't run on Alexander Hamilton's great financial genius and his economic system if everyone knows that he personally went bankrupt. So ultimately, Eliza was forced to sell their home, but the Federalists and allies helped buy it back. Now, Eliza, despite being impoverished and suffering these difficulties, continued to work on the causes that they'd worked on during their marriage. She continued to work on behalf of orphans. She helped found the Orphan Asylum of New York City, the city's first private orphanage. She eventually became its first directress. She also fundraised for the African Free School for freed Americans that Alexander Hamilton had helped found as part of the work of the New York Manumission Society. And we think, most fun, she fundraised for the Washington Monument. In 1846, after 4 decades of trying to get the Washington Monument built, the men in charge of the National Monument Society decided to approach Eliza Hamilton and Dolly Madison, who both happened to be living in D.C. at that time. They asked them to spearhead the fundraising, and they did it within the next 12 to 18 months. The groundbreaking ceremony was on July 4th, 1848, where the speaker finally acknowledged Alexander's central role in the founding of the nation, which was very heartening to Eliza because she had been working very hard to preserve his legacy. And that's why I want to discuss her as a warrior. We've talked about her as a wife and widow, but we think that our portrayal of Eliza as a very spirited fighter might be our most important contribution to the historical discussion. Most portrayals of Eliza in Hamilton biographies and even in the musical paint her as shy and retiring and hesitant to insert herself. They paint her as sweet and saintly, infinitely forgiving. And this might be because Alexander Hamilton refers to her often in his letters as his angel. So this was our impression too in going into the project. But our idea changed dramatically when we discovered a little letter at the New York Historical Society. The letter in question was from Eliza's older sister, Angelica. And in this letter, Angelica recounts that she is furious with someone. Unfortunately, we don't know who. This person, however, needs a good dressing down, and it appears that Angelica sent them to Eliza to be put in their place because, quote, "you know how Mrs. Hamilton can be," unquote. Now, when we read this, we thought, no, Angelica, we have no idea. Tell us. How was Eliza? How could Mrs. Hamilton be? Unfortunately, she could not tell us from the grave, but we did have to look more closely at all the evidence that we had. So we started to notice a pattern of Eliza inserting herself. As early as Eliza and Alexander's courtship, a famous British spy master named John Andre was captured. Now, Eliza happened to have known him, and though we only have Hamilton's side of the correspondence, it appears that Eliza took up a crusade to either save John Andre or have him at least shot as a gentleman instead of hanged as a spy. As a new bride, she actually wasn't even a bride yet. They were just in a courtship. And yet here she is, a young woman, inserting herself at the highest level of revolutionary politics, asking Alexander to intercede with George Washington. And what's more, he did. He even went so far as to try to write an anonymous letter to the British to make a trade. But unfortunately, Alexander was really not very good at being sneaky. He usually gets caught when he tries to do these things. And one of the most amusing things about this interlude is that the British, we have this letter that he wrote to the British, and the British have just made a notation in the margin that said, "This is Alexander Hamilton." So he was not fooling anyone. In the end, however, George Washington kept his own counsel, did not follow Alexander's advice, and had John Andre hanged. Now, Eliza, when we look at the evidence of her life, she traveled with Alexander. She could have stayed home with her wealthy family, but she went with him with the army and continued on with the war. She was a crusader for the causes she adopted. And she didn't just memorialize her husband. She had to fight for their legacy, not just against their enemies, which you would expect, but against their friends. Now, in the wake of Alexander Hamilton's death, of course, the Jeffersonian Republicans were eager to erase or reverse Hamilton's accomplishments. He had been their political foe. But Alexander's own party, the Federalists, were really struggling to win elections. And they got it in their head that maybe it was because they'd been founded by that guy who had an affair and then wrote a book about it. So what they ended up doing is starting to argue that George Washington was really the founder of their party and to minimize Alexander's contributions. To that end, they managed to get hold of Alexander Hamilton's draft of the farewell address and keep it from Eliza so that she couldn't claim and claim correctly that Alexander Hamilton had drafted it. She ended up having to file a lawsuit to get these papers back. She commissioned a biography of Alexander, and when she couldn't find anyone willing to do it, she browbeat her son into the job. She fought to receive his war pension. He probably wouldn't have approved of that because Hamilton gave up his claim to a war pension so that he could argue for soldiers without appearing to have a conflict of interest. She fought to gain recognition of his work. And she, of course, fought tirelessly for orphans, and she spoke out against slavery. The final piece of evidence that convinced us that the portrayal of Eliza as a sweet, retiring, angelic lady was not the real picture is a much ballyhooed encounter that she had with James Monroe near the end of our lives. Now, because our book is framed by this encounter, I won't give away the ending, but suffice to say that she was not intimidated by our fifth president, and she was, above all, a fighter. So in My Dear Hamilton, we tried to tell a quintessentially American story about service to country. Not just Alexander's service, but Eliza's as well. And the Hamiltons shared a great love story with each other and also the country that they helped find. Their story reminds us that real people fought and worked and sacrificed to defend this nation, and that's a legacy we all still share today. And now I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was wonderful. I did get 2 questions that came in. The first one here is from Kathy. And she says Alexander appeared to struggle with his career in politics. Can you talk about why this was?
Well, he had a big mouth. He was intemperate. The duel that killed him was not the first that he was involved in. He pretty much had a fight with every other founding father. He was very opinionated, and so this probably limited him. He had great reserves of intellectual power, and he was a fabulous writer, and he worked super hard. He was actually quite a visionary. But Thomas Jefferson was a better politician's politician. Jefferson had better control over himself, over what he wrote. He was a better schmoozer, and he had more self-control ultimately. So, and he lived, he outlived Alexander, so he gets more glory, at least until recently. There's not a Jefferson musical.
Correct.
Not that I know of.
Well, thank you. And this question comes from her daughter. Her name's not listed, but she says, I just finished My Dear Hamilton. Which book of yours do you recommend I start with next?
Well, if you haven't already read America's First Daughter, that's sort of the natural counterpoint, and we're going to be discussing that one next week. Is that right? Is it next week? Can you remind
Next Saturday.
Next Saturday, yeah. We're going to talk about America's First Daughter, so we'll see the other side. It's usually easier to read Jefferson first and Hamilton next because Hamilton is a very small part of Jefferson's long life. Hamilton is mostly a formidable foe for Jefferson, but not a super villain. He's not around long enough to make that much of a dent. On the other hand, in Hamilton's life, Jefferson looms large, and he seems like almost a cartoon villain sometimes from the Jefferson or from the Hamiltonian point of view. So just keep in mind that everybody has their own perspective. So if you read My Dear Hamilton, that's just what Eliza thought of Jefferson, and now you'll get the other point of view in America's First Daughter. If you have already read that, then I highly recommend Ribbons of Scarlet, which is about our French founding mothers who started the French Revolution. I shouldn't say our French founding mothers. I should say France's first founding mothers. However, it does include our French founding mother, Adrienne Lafayette. Lafayette is both a Frenchman and an American revolutionary. And my next novel, which is going to be coming out in March of 2021, is about his legacy and the women who defended it, both French and Americans. And I'm so excited about that. And we're going to be doing a cover reveal for that on Bastille Day. So if you go to my website, you can sign up and be a part of that. And I hope you will. That's stephaniedray.com.
Thank you, Stephanie. We have two more that just came in. One from Anthony, and he asks, what rank did he make it to?
He was a general. Do you mean in the military?
I believe so.
I believe ultimately he was an inspector general. That didn't happen until the Adams administration. But during the war, he was lieutenant colonel. I'm sorry, during the American Revolutionary War.
And I think our last one is coming from Nick. And he asks, while reading this book, I was shocked at the drama that filled Mrs. Hamilton's life. Did you have the same reaction while researching?
Yes, thank you for asking that, because we were shocked too. It's one of the reasons the book is so long. I kept thinking, I need things to stop happening to this woman so that I can wrap this story up. But that was not the case. And you probably will notice in the novel, there's a lot of riots. And we had to cut out a bunch of riots that didn't make the cut. I think we often as Americans think that there was a revolution, and then we won the revolution, and then everything was smooth sailing. That is not the case. There was a lot of unrest, and the Hamiltons were right in the middle of all of it.
All right. Well, I think those were all the questions that came in. Thank you so much for answering those, and also so much for your presentation. Did you want to speak real quick about your next talk on July 18th at 10:30?
Yes, I'll be talking about America's First Daughter then, and we will be discussing Jefferson both as a founding father, but more importantly, as a father.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. We appreciate you being here tonight, and we look forward to seeing you next Saturday, the 18th at 6:30, or I'm sorry, 10:30 a.m. And for all of you tuning in tonight, we will be doing another book giveaway for America's First Daughter. And please just check for our Facebook post on that this early next week, and we'll be doing some book giveaways for that. So again, thank you all so much for tuning in. And Stephanie, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Great time. See you soon.
Thank you.